We've heard a lot about leadership so far during this conference, how you can look after your others, your staff, your volunteers, making sure your volunteers are feeling relevant and required, rewarded, all those R words. But what about looking after yourself? John Brogden is the chairman of Lifeline, Australia's leading suicide prevention service. John's been Managing Director and CEO of the Australian Institute of Company Directors since January last year. From 2002 to 2005, he was Leader of the Opposition in the New South Wales Parliament. In 2014, John was appointed as a member of the Order of Australia for significant service to the community through representational roles with social welfare organisations, particularly Lifeline, to the business and financial sectors, and to the Parliament of New South Wales. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John Brogden.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here this afternoon and for the opportunity to speak to such an important group of Australians. Why are you important? Well, I'm the son of an 83-year-old serial volunteer. My father, from the day that he retired as a carpenter at the age of 60, has never missed a day of working as a carpenter, but has enjoyed almost every day of volunteering. He's, I think, done the Royal Easter Show volunteering in Sydney for about 20 years straight. He does the MS rides and all of those sorts of things, endless volunteering. He has two measures of the success of his volunteering: the number of free T-shirts he gets and the quality of the free lunch you give him. And he loves it. He loves every bit of it. It's part of his life. So much so that my wife and I laugh when we ask him to attend something important for our children and he says, no, I've got my volunteering. So, as you would know, with the thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people that you look after and manage and lead across the country in different charities, he's one of those people who not only enjoys what he does, but loves what he does. I have sometimes, in a speech like this, I try and think about what my context in a speech like this is with a crowd such as this. And I'm trying to think of when was the first volunteer role I had. As you heard, I was in politics for 10 years in New South Wales. I joined the Liberal Party at the age of 17 in my school uniform over in the inner west of Sydney. I came from a good Labor background. My grandmother told me it was a passing phase I'd go through, and Auntie Kate cried when I told her I joined the Liberal Party. And I remember, I think, the first piece of volunteering was probably for the Liberal Party. But beyond that, as somebody growing up in Haberfield, next to the suburb of Ashfield in Sydney, I got to know the Reverend Bill Cruz and the Exodus Foundation. And I went on his board at the age of about 18. I now look back as the Managing Director of the Australian Institute of Company Directors and think I had no idea what my director's liabilities were at the age of 18. But I got in and involved with, at that stage, an incredibly grassroots, very local, very personality-driven but exciting and important charity. And looking now to the way the charity sector, the not-for-profit sector, the civil society, call it what you will, has become such a critical part of what we do in Australia and an irreplaceable part of what we do in Australia. I'm very proud to be a volunteer myself, and I'm very proud to see so many people who are engaged in volunteering for the betterment of Australia. I know we put dollar figures on volunteering and the cost of doing what we do. I know every summer when there are terrible bushfires in Australia, it's important to pause and think about what it would cost us to pay those volunteers to be out stopping those fires, and there are any number of different analogies we could use there. But it is a critical part of the Australian economy and a critical part of what we do. And I don't know about you, and some of you have got more grey hair than I have, but I sense that volunteering has increasingly become a critical feature of the Australian character. We've always talked about, robust, tough, resilient, droughts, flooding rains, all of those sorts of things. But I get the sense that the role we play beyond what we get paid to do, volunteering at whatever level and anywhere, I think is now part of the Australian character and a part of the Australian psyche. And people are incredibly proud to wear a T-shirt that has volunteer emblazoned across it. And I think those people engaging with the volunteers are incredibly grateful for the work that they do. I'm probably telling you exactly everything you already know, but I hope you have indulged me to take a moment to reinforce the good work that you do and that your volunteers do in making Australia a great country. I want to talk a little bit about leadership. I want to tell you about how you cannot look after yourself as a leader and how you can look after yourself as a leader. In talking about leadership, as I said before, I was in the New South Wales Parliament for 10 years. I served with a guy in Parliament who's could best be described kindly as thick as two short planks. He was not a genius. There is an argument about whether he was even a nice man. But he had spent some time in the military, and he used an analogy with me that I've never heard before or since that I think is a great demonstration of leadership. He was an Australian Army officer in the US in the 1980s on an exchange for 12 months, and he was taking part in a very large training exercise, as only the American military could do. Thousands of troops, tens of thousands of troops, thousands of tanks, aircraft, a serious exercise. And he was at the headquarters of this exercise, way back behind the troops. And the general arrived, the head of the exercise arrived, and he got all of the officers and he put them in their jeeps and he drove them up to the most forward position, to a private sitting in a foxhole dugout, and pulled this private up. Now you can only imagine what a private would think about a general and all these officers turning up. And the private stood up and the general said, "Son, do you know what you're doing here? Do you know what you're doing here?" And the private said, "No, I don't." And he turned to his officers and said, "That's your fault, not his fault." And I always think that one of the great tests of leadership is, does everybody in your organisation know what they're doing and know what the organisation's doing? At the Australian Institute of Company Directors, we employ 270 staff. We have 38,000 members. We have offices all around the country. We'll educate over 4,000 people this year. We provide other sorts of member services. But like any organisation of that size, we have people in IT, we have people in human resources, we have a number of people who aren't what, I don't know where that horrible phrase of customer-facing came from, but aren't customer-facing or member-facing. They're critical corporate services to our organisation, but they would go a lifetime without actually meeting a member of the ARCD. So as a new CEO 15 months ago, I decided that we should have governance training, we should take some of our own courses, and we should teach all of our staff the sort of stuff that we teach our members and others. Had a half-day session for all of the staff. And I grabbed a couple of the staff afterwards randomly, forgetting, of course, the power of the CEO to scare people to death when you say, "Have you got a minute to come into my office?" Sat down one of the women on reception and said, "What did you get out of that?" And it was like opening up the manual and listening to her deliver me everything perfectly. And she understood it. And I thought, well, you've done pretty well there, John. Congratulations. And I grabbed one of the guys out of IT who was literally shaking when I sat the poor bugger down. And I said, "What did you find out of that?" And I realised that because we educate with an expectation of what a company director does, he had no idea what a company director is. So how can we educate somebody who doesn't know what a company director does if they don't know what they are? Now, he's great at his IT job. He's fantastic. But he doesn't know what we do at the AICD, and he doesn't know who our members are at the AICD. So that's a great experience for me to show that we have to really understand our workforce and make sure that whether they're on the front line or critically in the back office, they all understand what we do. They all absolutely understand it. I think that's one of the great measures of leadership. And this will sound a little bit hierarchical, but when you walk into an office, if the receptionist doesn't know what you do, doesn't know what they do and doesn't know what the company does, then there's something wrong with the organisation. Now, it's easy for some organisations because what they do is very clear and very obvious. So it's about how you do it, it's about what you believe in, what your values are. And they are all important things, very important things. I went into Parliament at the age of 27 after trying to get in on a number of occasions. I grew up in Balmain, born in Balmain before it was trendy. Grew up in Haberfield before that was trendy. Mum was a school secretary, Dad was a carpenter. We were a working class family and I had an interest in politics. So I went along on one Tuesday night in the middle of winter in 1986. I went down to my local government organisation, Ashfield Council, and I sat down and sat through 3 hours of a local council meeting, and by some miracle I was still interested in politics at the end of it. I got up and I walked up to the Mayor and I said, "Hello, Mr Mayor, my name's John Brogden and I'd like to join the Liberal Party." And this wonderful little man, now deceased, a little bloke called Lou Herman was the Mayor. He'd been the Mayor for 20 years. And Lou put out his hand and he said, "Hello, John, my name's Lou Herman. I'm from the Labor Party. Go and speak to those people over there." So I did. And I got active in the Liberal Party. I went to university, but I had a real passion for politics. And coming from a difficult background, we had domestic violence at home, we had alcoholism at home. I spent a lot of my year 12 leaving home, coming back, leaving home, coming back with Mum, over to my grandmother's with all of the domestic violence. Not my father, another man. It was pretty hideous. And that drove me to want to make a contribution and to want to make Australia a better place. And to not make my life, matter not for me, but for others. So I wanted to get into Parliament. I tried on a few occasions. I was elected at 27. I was elected to a very safe seat on the northern beaches of Sydney. For those of you who aren't from Sydney, I was the member for Home and Away. Home and Away was filmed in my electorate. North Palm Beach Surf Club is actually Summer Bay or whatever it is on Home and Away. And it was a beautiful part of Sydney. Married young, very beautiful woman to whom I'm still married with 3 wonderful children. At the age of 30, I went into Parliament in opposition. At the age of 30, I became a shadow minister. At the age of 33, on my 33rd birthday, by great coincidence, I became the leader of the opposition in New South Wales. And I hope to think that I was restlessly ambitious. I may have been ruthlessly ambitious, but as my grandmother said to me when I was a young man, "John, watch out for the people on the way up if you climb over them because they'll be there on the way you come down, as you come down." So I hope I was restless in my ambition. I hope I was. But I was keen to arrive very early. So at the age of 33, I think the youngest person ever to hold the role of leadership of a major political party anywhere in Australia. I look back thinking, I don't know whether it was arrogance or confidence, or I don't know that I knew what I didn't know enough to be able to take that job at 33, but I took it and I worked hard at it. We lost the election when I was first leader. We expected to lose that election. That was sort of one under the belt as such, and then I very much focused myself on winning the next election. I became leader of the opposition on Easter Thursday, Good Thursday, call it what you will, and out of respect for the person who I had beaten in the leadership ballot by 1 vote, out of respect for her, I didn't rush into her office and I said, "Kerry, look, you stay till you want to stay." And she said, "I'll be out on Tuesday afternoon." So on Tuesday afternoon I went over, I had a very professional conversation with the person I'd beaten in the ballot. You know, I'd squashed her life ambitions in favour of mine. She was incredibly generous and incredibly professional. And we remain friends to this day. She's not upset with me, she's upset for the people who voted for me who she thought was voting for her. But nonetheless, we had a professional conversation and she walked out of the office and she had, as you do in political offices, cleaned out everything. She'd taken everything. And it's quite an ugly 1970s office, but it's big. And I remember getting up from the soft lounge and walking to the desk and sitting behind it for the first time. And for the first time in my life, I understood the phrase, "It's lonely at the top." This big cavernous room with views of Sydney Harbour, hideous wood panelling, all of this responsibility, and I was alone. And I look back at that and think that that was a symbolically important way to start that role. Because ultimately, even after extraordinary amounts of consultation and genuine consultation, you get paid the big money or you get to be the chairman of Lifeline for nothing, whatever it might be, because you have to make the decisions. You have to make the decision. Somebody has to make the decision. So making the decision can be quite challenging for some people. Consultation is excellent. It's critical to that process. Hearing people's views. The fear of failure is bad. If I wasn't to worry about failure, I would never have made a decision to go up the ladder anywhere in my life at any stage. My philosophy is that there's absolutely nothing wrong with failure, just as long as you learn from it and to your best effort don't make that same mistake again. One of the greatest mistakes we make with people who fail is you never ask this question: what did you do right? Because by and large, in most cakes that don't rise, some of the recipe was good, some of it worked. Maybe one thing, maybe only one element was wrong. Maybe everything else was right, but one element was wrong. It may have been an element outside your control. It may have been a collapse in the economy, a change of government policy, the day may have been rained out, whatever it may have been. Nobody ever stops to ask the question, what did you do right? We only like to analyse what we do wrong. In Australia, we've often talked about having a tall poppy syndrome. I don't know that we have a tall poppy syndrome anymore. I think we've learnt to celebrate and praise people who, by and large, are successful. Our Prime Minister at the moment, love him or hate him, is an extremely wealthy man. He's never tried to hide that, and some people would admire his wealth and his achievement. Others may criticise it. But if a very wealthy man, and that hasn't happened in Australia for a long time, can be Prime Minister, and we can think that's a good thing, so we can think that sports people and other people who achieve in different parts of life are worthy of our praise and consideration and respect. What I do think we do in Australia is we punish failure very hard. We punish it very hard. I can make the easy American analogy that Americans, if you haven't failed 3 times, then you're never going to be a success. They celebrate failure in order to achieve success. Jack Welch, some of you may have heard of him, he ran GE and made it an enormous company in America, writes in one of his books, I've met him in person, fascinating, great, only America makes these sorts of people. Great guy. He said, I'm the only person who became the CEO of a company after blowing up a factory. He literally blew up one of his factories went on his way up the ladder. And we need to understand and embrace as leaders that you're not going to get everything right. That you're not going to get everything right. So a critical element of leadership, I think, is humility. And a very critical part of leadership is self-awareness. As I said before, I had what many would describe as a terrific political career, arriving at a job at a young age, losing an election, always knew that was going to happen, and then focusing very much on the next election. I became incredibly focused on my work. I was working 6 and 7 days a week and 6 and 7 nights a week. I would be up at 6 o'clock every morning. We'd do a telephone conference at 6:05, find out what was on the radio. Be me, my deputy leader, my staff. Some poor bugger on the office had to get in at 5 a.m, read all the papers, check all the radios. We'd find out what the radios were doing. This is 2002, so people used to read newspapers, not go online. It's only 15 years ago, 12, 13 years ago, 14 years ago. Then we'd be off. You do this, you ring up 2GB, you ring up 2UE, what are we doing, what time's the press conference, all of that sort of stuff. Run right through, home at 11 o'clock that night, speeches through the day. And I got better and better at my job. There's no doubt I got better and better at my job. The only person who didn't believe that was me. Because no matter how hard I worked, no matter how good the speech was, I was absolutely unwilling to believe that I was doing well. I was my own worst critic. And I used to visualise, sort of in my mind, when I would stop and think about how silly this was, sort of an escalator going up, like at a shopping centre. You go up an escalator, you get off, you go up again, you go. For me, I could never reach the peak, no matter how well I'd done, because I was so self-critical, because I lacked such a degree of self-awareness. I was not able to celebrate my success. and know what I was good at. I worked harder and harder. My deputy, Barry O'Farrell, later the Premier of New South Wales, came in one day and said to me, "John, you need to slow down." And I looked at him and said, "Barry, I need to speed up. I need to work harder." And I could not understand why anyone would say that. I adopted a rule that the Royal Navy had, the British Navy had at the height of the British Empire, was that they had to have a navy bigger than the size of the second and third largest navies in the world. Great rule to have. So I had to work harder. Whoever the other two in the joint who worked really hard, I had to be seen to be working harder than those two combined. And I had to set a cracking pace. And I worked very hard, incredibly hard. But my wife Lucy, standing on the side, watched me begin to spin and spin faster. And she was very worried for me. And she was worried that I had depression, because what had begun to happen for me is that when I got home, or when I was quiet or with friends or family in very small groups, I was miserable company. I didn't want to talk to people. I'd quite happy just to sit on the lounge and veg out. Publicly, you would have seen me in a suit and a tie at question time or in front of the cameras, performing well, doing everything you have to do well in a job like that, with an aspiration of becoming Premier of the largest state in this country, the second biggest job, I guess, in government in Australia. But internally, I was miserable. I was unable to accept that I was doing well. I used to have this phenomenal habit that I'd adopted. I look back at it now and think how embarrassing it must have sounded. I would give a speech. It'd be a good speech. I go bad speeches, but I'd give a good speech and I'd sit down at the table at the dinner, say to the person next to me, "How was that?" Looking for praise. Of course, who's going to say miserable, but looking for praise. I realised how miserable and how pathetic this sounded, so I changed it to, "Is that what you wanted?" which was another way of getting some sort of praise, because I didn't believe I delivered a good speech. I was forever yelling at my staff. I've apologised to all of them since. I was behind the scenes becoming increasingly agitated and increasingly desolate. And Lucy was worried that I had depression. Now, if you had told me I had depression, I would have said to you, that's clearly a conspiracy to get me out of my job and undermine me. So I wasn't ready to hear that message. I had seen psychologists and psychiatrists in the past from the difficult things that we had at home as kids, but I'd never really cracked it. I want to pause for a minute to tell you a very funny story, because I think it's potassium is regarded, I always get this wrong, is it potassium the bananas? Potassium the bananas? Potassium's regarded, or was back then, as a very good thing to treat depression. So all of a sudden at home, Lucy's making banana cakes and we're having roast lamb with banana, and about 3 months later she worked out you'd have to reach a body weight daily in banana for it to make any difference in terms of the amount of potassium. So she sat there. We didn't have children at the start of my time in politics. By the time I'd left, we had a son who was a year and a half old, now 12. And I was isolated, I was angry. Behind the scenes, I was difficult to be with. I was phenomenally driven. And I clearly had depression, but I was the only one who didn't understand that. Now, I was on track, probably, history might say, if not to have a decent crack of becoming the Premier of New South Wales. My opponent, Bob Carr, retired after 10 very successful political years as Premier. At a cocktail party a few weeks later, I said and did a few stupid things, had not too much to drink, but I had a few drinks, so it was easy to fall into the stereotype that he had too many drinks and said and done some stupid things. It all hit the newspaper, and such was the shame about what I'd done, not to myself, but to my wife, to my family, to my supporters, to my political party, to my people, that I resigned. I resigned almost instantly. And I remember our party whip from Wagga, who rang me and abused, "Do not resign, stick it out, stick it out." But I just had been working on adrenaline for so long that when I screwed up, I had to resign. Now, I can write you the strategy any day you like to keep you in the job I was in and to keep you in the job I was in, but I couldn't do it myself. I couldn't do it. So if I was the deputy or the staff member or the loyal supporter, I probably could have got you through it, but I couldn't see a way through myself. I resigned. I took the blame for what I'd said and done. Went home that afternoon and decided, we had media outside the house. I mean, it was horrific, but I was a public figure. But we decided, no, get up, go to work the next day. I went to work the next day in my electorate office up on the northern beaches of Sydney. Cameras outside the house, cameras outside the office. Took a few phone calls, left at 5 o'clock that night. I didn't want the people who'd elected me locally, and I didn't want others to think that I was going to take time off. So most normal people would take a day off. For me, I said, no, I want to show that I'm committed to my local electorate, even though I'm no longer leader of the opposition. I got home that night. Mum was there. She'd come over to help. Our little boy was 18 months old. Lucy was there. And at 5:45, I got a phone call from my then former press secretary. He said, John, the Daily Telegraph has got this story about you. It alleges all these things to do with your personal behaviour, and they're going to run it. Sorry, the phone call was at 6:15. The significance of that is the Supreme Court is closed and you can't injunct a newspaper. So it's one of the old tricks. In the old days, you always ring after the courts are closed. And I had nowhere to go. About 5% of what was going to be printed was true. The rest of it was salacious and wrong. But at that point, I realised I would need to wait up to here in order to say this is wrong, that's right. When I said that, I meant this. No, I didn't do that, etc. And I decided at that point, standing in our lounge room with Lucy and Mum in the kitchen, that the best thing for me to do, not the only thing, the best thing for me to do was to take my own life. Because I had put so much shame on everybody around me, and there was more coming, that the only way through that was to take my own life. And you may have experienced this yourself. You may have lived with or loved people who've been at this point in their life. You may have lost people. But for me, once I knew what to do, I calmly went about doing it. I left home, made up a story to Lucy. I know to this day she completely knew that that wasn't the case and there was something wrong, but she didn't know what to do. Took myself to my office and started the process of killing myself, taking my own life. I thank God every day that my staff member out there thought there was something wrong, happened to be down the road, came to get in, journalists outside the office, called the police, stopped me and got me to hospital. And for me to get from almost the pinnacle of my life, something I'd always wanted to be a politician, I'd always wanted to be Premier of New South Wales. If you'd asked anybody I went to school with, gee, it's remarkable that bloke's opposition leader at 33, they would have said to you, I thought he'd be there at 23. I mean, such was my very clear focus about what I wanted to do. And it all fell to pieces, and within 48 hours of it falling to pieces, I was in the suicide ward at Royal North Shore Hospital. And I then transferred across to a private clinic and spent a few days there getting better. And I thought, indeed, I was the only person who thought I wouldn't be better next week. I was the only person who thought, I'll be right, I'll be better next week. It's like a flu, you'll get over it. Everybody around me knew it would take some time. So even at that point in my life, I completely lacked the self-awareness to understand what was going on. We did what too many people I know and have talked to do after an event like this. You decide, let's go and have a holiday. Worst part about that is I think you take yourself out of your ordinary life, and sitting over there in Fiji after 3 days knowing this isn't the real life I'm coming back to, I was so agitated, I was so upset. We flew back home and went straight back into the clinic, and within a week I resigned from Parliament. So convinced was I that I could never recover in the public eye. Resigned from Parliament, spent another few weeks in hospital and came out of hospital. It took me about 9 months to get well, to get mentally well. Physically there were no issues that were medium to long term, but emotionally and mentally I was very unwell. I'd shower, get in the car to go down the road, couldn't drive down the road, couldn't get out of the car, couldn't walk, have to get back in the car, walk down the street, couldn't look people in the eye. Then this extraordinary thing began to happen. People would stop me, people who knew me and people who didn't know me, the majority of whom didn't know me, and would say to me, "John, how are you?" They'd force me to look up into their eyes because I couldn't do that initially. And they'd say, "How are you?" And whichever way they said it, whichever words they chose, the message was very, very simple. And it was one of or both of these messages. I've been where you've been, or my dad's been where you've been, or my brother or my sister's been where you've been, and or everybody makes mistakes in life. Everybody makes mistakes in life. Everybody deserves a second go. Lucy and I received in the month or so that followed my suicide attempt, 10,000, this is 2005, so no, emails were a minor thing back then, hard to imagine today. Emails, faxes, there you go. Emails, faxes, letters, gifts, flowers from 10,000 people. The outpouring of public sympathy and empathy was extraordinary. One of our neighbours broke into our house so they could clean it, so it was clean when we came home. We had meals cooked, on and on the list goes. And I have one, I should photocopy it and put it in my pocket. I memorised the letter, I don't need to. I had one letter on fluoro green paper. It was a bloke, post-restaurant, Darwin, Northern Territory. Having grown up in a working class family, I had to find out what that is. That means you're moving around an area and you'll pick up your mail from the post office. So this guy is travelling around the Northern Territory, so you're getting a picture of a bit of a character. And now my name's John Brogden, so the letter said, "Dear Mr Ogden, we all make mistakes, comma, that's why pencils have rubbers on the other end, full stop." And we laugh about that, and I tell you that to laugh. But I tell you, if I'm looking for any simple phrase that demonstrates that those of us who make mistakes in our life deserve a second chance, maybe a third chance, maybe a fourth chance, that was it for me. And I remember a few months later when the government called the by-election to replace me, to fill the seat that I'd vacated. And I was shopping at Coles, I think, or Woolies in Mona Vale. And a woman came up to me. I was very much back in the news again. There's a by-election being held for the seat vacated by da-da-da-da-da. At that point, I was always disgraced former opposition leader. And I was walking down, and this woman grabbed me. And she grabbed me, I'll just demonstrate. Grabbed me like this, and she said, John, you didn't say those things that they said. You said you didn't say those things. And she was a tiny lady, and I pulled myself up to my 6'3" and I said, look, I did say them. And she let go of my arm and walked away, and I thought, oh. And she stopped and turned around and said, they must have spiked your drink. And off she went. So unwilling to believe that I could ever do or say anything wrong. So I got healthier as time went on. I couldn't leave home for a long time in terms of, going out for lunch or dinner. I couldn't read a newspaper for 6-8 months. I couldn't see television news. I just had to isolate myself. My wife was magnificent, extraordinary. I had good doctors, great nurses, and after a few months, the doctor under whose care I was, to his eternal credit, didn't put me on depression medication straight away. He wanted everything to settle down to work out whether I did have underlying depression, and I did. So it's now been over 11 years that I've been on medication for depression. I've probably had depression for a whole lot longer, but I've been medicated now for 10 years. So I can tell you how not to handle leadership. That's not how to handle leadership. Balance is important and self-awareness is incredibly important. If you'd said to me 15 years ago, John, are you self-aware? I would have said to myself, what is this Buddhist bullshit you're talking about? They didn't teach me, the nuns and the brothers didn't teach me about self-awareness. I am much more self-aware now. I undertook one of the great experiences in my life, and I was lucky to be asked for somebody to come and ask me if they could help me with this. It's called outplacement. It's a terrible phrase. It's career transition, call it what you will. And I did it with this magnificent woman, since passed away, who was a bit of a doyen of this industry in Australia. And she asked me 4 questions nobody had ever asked me before in my life. She asked me these questions. What are you good at? What are you bad at? What do you like doing? And what don't you like doing? The only questions I've ever been asked in my life like that were, what do you want to do? What job do you want? Now, being asked what job you want and what you're good at, bad at, like doing and don't like doing, are poles apart. Because one of them, and these are the right 4 questions, by the way, these are the questions that make you think about what you want to do in life and what you're good at in life. And they also tell you what you're not good at, what your weaknesses are as a leader. So I've always wanted to be a leader. I'm not embarrassed to say that. I've been a good leader and a bad leader. I've done good things, I've made mistakes. I've made people happy, I've upset people. I've been focused about what I want to do and how I want to achieve it. But I'm now very good at knowing what I'm good at and what I'm not good at, and employing in a professional sense to my weakness, and capitalising on my strength. Never being embarrassed to say, I don't understand that. There's a great expectation as a leader that you can't say, I don't understand that you've got to sit there nodding in the meeting about somebody using a 3-letter acronym and pretend you know what it means. And because you're the CEO, you couldn't possibly pause to ask a question of what the hell does XYZ mean? I mean, you have to know everything that's discussed. And I have no problem. I want an environment as the CEO. I want an environment as a chairman, as a leader, where people feel very free to say, oh, look, can you hold on? I'm just not clear what that is, and I don't understand those initials. And there's no shame in asking those questions. The only shame is if you think you can get away with bluffing your way through those sorts of areas. I try to lead by example, and I think it's hard to lead by example, to be honest. But I've come to recognise that as a leader, whatever you do is observed and it's read into. And we have 2 floors of an office in Sydney. We have offices around the country, but our head office in Sydney has 2 floors. I was up looking at a space in the floor above me in the corner, and within a day people were telling me that's where I was moving my office. So you do have to begin to realise that people look and follow you. It's not unlike, for those of you who have children, the way your children imitate and follow you and read into what you do. So we have 3 beautiful children, 12, 10 and 8. I've never had a conversation, Lucy and I have never had a conversation with our kids where we sit down and say, look, in our family, we do these things, we believe these things, we do those things and we don't believe in those things. Never had that conversation. I often listen to people who say, my dad always told me, I never had that as a kid, and I try not to do that with my children. But what it means is, wow, they absolutely look at what you do and how you do it, and that influences their life. And your employees aren't children, your volunteers aren't children, but that is a strong human trait that we all have in our DNA. So when our children say, when I grow up I want to be a volunteer, my wife's a surf lifesaving volunteer, I do the barbie down at the club, Lucy's out on the beach. I gave up surf lifesaving as a volunteer because I decided that if a journalist was drowning I probably wouldn't save them. So I thought I had to give it up and I'd be safer behind the barbecue. So, are you a journo? So we get involved, the kids see that involvement. My wife's on the Mental Health Commission, she's involved in a lot of volunteer activities. You know, we're involved with the kids here and the kids there and community stuff. And we've never sat down and said to the kids, in our family we give some back, we volunteer. Never said that, they just watch it happen. And they see it with Poppy as well. They see it with Poppy. So that's part of our DNA in our family. And the same as leadership, if I can transfer the analogy to leadership. If they see you coming late to meetings all the time, if they see you having too many drinks at an event, whatever it might be, you really do model good behaviour in the organisation. You really do. And that's why, as a leader, you have to model risky behaviour. Now, people panic when you talk about risk. They certainly panic about the word risky, but you have to model a willingness to take a calculated risk. Because if the people who founded your organisations, in the case of Lifeline, if Alan Walker didn't decide in 1963 we needed a telephone crisis counselling service for people who were killing themselves and didn't take the risk in setting it up and paying the money and didn't take the risk that people would volunteer and didn't take the risk that people would call and didn't take the risk that we could save their lives, there wouldn't be a Lifeline, And I've told a story all of you could tell about every organisation you're involved in. So you have to show them that it's worth taking a risk, but equally they can't be punished for failure if they took a calculated risk and planned it properly. One of the great things I think you have to display and teach as a leader is judgment. That's challenging. There's no Bachelor of Judgment, there's no Masters of Judgment, there's no PhD in judgment. But in the way you do things, you display judgment. And I ultimately think you have to be a person who's willing to have and show humility. If the boss makes a mistake, if the chairman makes a mistake, whoever it is, they need to apologise for that. And they need to demonstrate that they too can make mistakes. So 13 years later, I'm the chairman of Lifeline. I'm the chairman of what used to be called Landcom, now called Urban Growth in New South Wales Government's property development arm. I'm the chairman of two small local charitable organisations. I speak about mental health. I run an organisation with 270 staff and a $70 million budget with a high profile. I've run and sold companies worth $260 million. People say to me, how do you find the stress of running a business? There's a great Australian cricketer. I'm not a cricket fan enough. Keith Miller, who was a brilliant swashbuckling cricketer, complete cad under the old language, it is said, since long since passed away now. And he was a World War II fighter pilot in Europe. And I'm greatly unworthy of this analogy, but it's the way I think of it. And when people say, oh, compared to politics, how do you cope with business? Somebody asked Keith Miller once, Keith, there you are out there, you know, in front of the English bowlers. How do you take that pressure? And he said, son, a Messerschmitt up your arse is pressure. Standing on a cricket pitch isn't pressure. And I say, you know, after politics, it's hard to find pressure. It really is. It's hard to find pressure. But what I've done is I've come to terms with how to live better. I sleep more because I know I can't last on less sleep. I take my medication for my depression. Not embarrassed to tell you I'm depressed, not embarrassed to tell you I take my medication. I choose not to drink anymore. I can drink, but the medication doesn't allow me to drink much. I think it's safer not to drink at all. Somewhat challengingly, in my personal life, there are people, some of whom I'm related to, whose company get me upset. And I just don't see those people anymore. Now that's hard because I don't know about you, but I grew up in a norm where you all turned up at Christmas and you're all nice to each other. There was a reason why you only saw each other once a year, but you all turned up and there were all of these social norms. Well, I don't do the things that upset me anymore. There are a few physical places, like Parliament House in Sydney, I don't like to go to because they get me upset. So I just don't do them. So I'm much more aware now of what works for me and what doesn't work for me, what I'm good at, what I'm bad at, what I like doing, what I don't like doing. And I live my life preparing and dealing with the things I'm not good at and that upset me, and ensuring that I can do the things I'm good at as much as possible. Look, I've taken you through, you're standing up, which means it must be time. I've taken you through a bit of a journey today, and I want to finish with a quote. It's a quote I often use, and it describes the journey I've been through. Before I do that, I want to tell you that I've never heard this said before until I spoke at something recently. And the other speaker is a psychiatrist who's recently written a book. And I delivered a speech and he said, everyone I know who has survived a suicide attempt is injected with a new lease of life if you get through the other end. Not everybody does. Please don't think what I've achieved is achievable for everybody. You know, we all walk at different paces in life, and some people have better opportunities in life than others and greater means. And I have been lucky in many ways, and I'm grateful for that and aware of that. So filled with this sort of verve for life, if you like, and the knowledge that you're here you're not here forever and you're here to make a contribution. I'm become a very passionate advocate of mental health in Australia. I'm thrilled to be associated with a great organisation like Lifeline. Lifeline's one of many brilliant organisations in mental health and many brilliant organisations in volunteering in Australia. Time for a short ad. This year we'll take for the first time ever more than 1 million telephone calls, which is quite extraordinary. We answer 850,000 of them. Our target is to answer them all, and we're getting better every year. And we do that off the back of a majority of volunteers, highly trained volunteers answering our calls. Wonderful stuff. But the quote I want to end with tells you my journey in life, and I hope gives you some hope of what stands at the other end of difficult times in our life. The quote's from a speech delivered by Richard Nixon, the 37th President of the United States. Doesn't get a lot of good press these days. And he was swept from office after appalling behaviour, Watergate, on the 9th of August 1974. And he delivered this rambling speech before he left and went off in the helicopter, literally. And he stood at a platform with a microphone with his wife next to him and his 2 daughters and their husbands and all the White House staff in front of him. And if you want to find this quote, it's a terrific quote, go and look for YouTube, Nixon resignation speech. And he delivered this rambling speech, quoting from books and rambling speech. And amongst it is this nugget. And what he said describes the journey I've been in, and I hope the journey that people who go through difficult times as leaders or otherwise can go through. And he said this: "It's not until you've stood in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to stand on the highest mountain." Thank you.